All right, welcome back to the show to talk about China and Portugal. We've got Steve Keen with us. He's the head of economics, history, and politics at Kingston University. He's been writing a lot about China, and recently he said that the signs of a big crack in the great facade of China are everywhere. Ed first asked him what he meant by that, and here's what he had to say.
Well, again, the ironic thing is that the reason China got us out of the crisis was they turned on the spigots of credit. Because when the crisis hit back in 2008, it trashed China's export strategy. I think the collapse in their exports were of the order of 40% in 1 year. That's how much the downturn of the global economy hit their export strategy. And people were moving back from the cities to the countryside in millions. And the Chinese response was, we've got to boost demand domestically, and the easiest way to do that was to boost lending. Now, of course, in China, we call it a capitalist country, but I think they've got 5 major banks, and they're all state-owned, and of course, a lot of the businesses themselves, either state ventures or spun off from state ventures, and a lot of the bosses are Communist Party members themselves. So when the Communist Party tells you to lend money and you're a bank, you go and lend money. And when it's on offer, you don't refuse it early on. So you had an incredible growth in private debt, as recorded by the Bank of International Settlements in China starting in 2009. It went from 80% of GDP, 100% of GDP in 2009 to 180% at the beginning of this year. Now, when I graphed that level of debt, ratio of debt to GDP, and started it from the beginning of the bubble, which is 2009, and then compared that to Japan, whose bubble began, I think, back in '83, and America's, which began in 1992, 1993, the rate of growth of Chinese debt is 3 times as fast as either Japan or America experienced. So consequently, when you've got debt growing that fast, its slowdown can be just as dramatic. And that's what we're going through right now. The hitting of the order of 200% of GDP in the latest figures from the Bank of International Settlements for household and non-financial sector private debt in China. And it's got to slow down from growth rates that have been as high as 35% of GDP in 1 year. The slowdown itself, I mean, the sum of turnover of existing money plus the change in new debt, which I take as the metric of total demand for everything in an economy, will have to collapse. And I can see something of the order of a 10 or 15% fall in total demand in China coming out of that slowdown.
Well, you know, before we get to that point, do you think that the Chinese slowdown that we're seeing already is the big macro event that's infecting the emerging markets and causing the emerging markets overall to slow down?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm not as aware of the figures in other countries as I am of China. I'm not quite like I don't know India's data, for example. But clearly, this is the beginning of the end of the vaulted bricks in that sense, because we're also already seeing Brazil fall over. Russia hasn't exactly shining, and China is now going to go into a big slump. And from what they're doing, the Communist Party reaction to that has been to try to restore the bubble, which I think is totally a forlorn campaign. They can do it for a short while, they simply can't maintain it. So that's the end of the emerging markets as a sign of boosts to growth. And from what I've heard anecdotally around Southeast Asia, it appears we could be in for another version of the 1997 crash, with, on top of that, a scale of a downturn from China we've never seen before.
Well, that's not very cheery news, Steve. So I want to turn to something that's probably not cheery, but from a different angle, a bit closer to home for you, and that's Portugal. Let me tell you how I see Portugal, and then I'll ask you for your view here. Now, Portugal's recent general election was inconclusive without any party winning an absolute majority. The president allowed Prime Minister Pedro Passos Coelho to form a minority government, as has been done in the past when you get this kind of result. However, the way that he's gone about doing this has created a huge controversy. I mean, some people are calling it a coup. I'm not one of those people, but I do think that Portugal has a tough road ahead regarding debt sustainability. Now, I know you have a view on this. What do you make of what's happening in Portugal right now?
I think it's the most obvious sign of the death of democracy in Europe. And this is actually, in some ways, the consequence of the European Union itself and the formation of the euro in particular. A huge ambition in Europe after the Second World War was to stop politics mattering. And in some ways, the way that was done was to make the European Union a non-democratic institution. And the euro itself is a classic non-democratic institution. And finally, you get to the stage where that would only have worked if the economic program that the Eurozone and the euro in particular had embarked upon was going to be a successful campaign. But of course, I don't need to tell anybody it's failed. And the reason it's failed is because they didn't create a treasury, they limited government spending, they ignored growth in private debt, which caused the bubbles, which then crashed. So it's a total catastrophe. Now, in that situation, rather than maintaining an absence of democracy for the sake of prosperity and peace, they're maintaining an absence of democracy and enforcing poverty on people throughout southern Europe. So it's really a breaking point when they simply say you can't vote for a party that wants to leave the euro. That's no longer a political option. There's nothing more political in that sense than poverty. But that's what's being imposed on people, saying you can't choose anything other than poverty because that's the only effective program we're going to allow you to run in your economy.
Well, you know, Steve, this is a country that has had a deficit in excess of 7% in 2014. Public debt is well over 120% of GDP. External debt is over 200% of GDP, and total public and private debt is 370% of GDP. So in a recession, obviously, these figures are going to go higher. For Portugal's debt to be sustainable, given the present institutional framework which you outlined and the economic paradigm, austerity, that has to bring the deficit down, and nominal GDP has to grow for decades for this whole thing to work. None of this sounds plausible to me in any way, shape, or form. I mean, what's the potential for credit sustainability to diminish significantly going forward?
Oh, I think it's an inevitability. The conditions, as you've outlined, that level of debt, particularly, you said 120% of GDP is the government debt and 370% total. I haven't checked Portugal's figures. That's saying Portugal's private debt 2.5 times GDP. Again, this is a sign that it's private debt which caused the bubble beforehand and private debt that's caused the crisis by not growing afterwards. The only way out of this is to slash levels of private debt, which is why I've been arguing for a modern debt jubilee now for over 5 years. But that's the last thing that people are focusing upon. They're saying we must reduce the government debt by active economic policy. What I'm saying is we should actually reduce the level of private debt by active government policy using the state's capacity to create money to cancel private debt. And until we do that, in a way that doesn't disadvantage savers, by the way, we're going to be stuck in this nightmare. And what the euro is doing is actually making the nightmare more extreme.